Hey everybody! Today's mini lesson is on reading and understanding expressions in which letters stand for unknown numbers. I'm really excited to do this one with you all because after the pretest you took the first week of school, a lot of you came up to me and asked about this. There were math problems with letters in them on the pretest. What is that about? And so we're going to scratch the surface on that today and get started on it a little. So go ahead and write down this title on the next page in your math notebook, and after you are ready to do that, close it up and just listen, concentrate, think, and give me your best on the I do's. So let's talk about what an expression is again real quick. An expression is easiest to understand when you compare it to an equation. This is an expression. This is an equation because it has an equal sign in it. Equations have equal signs, expressions do not. We did harder ones. We did like that. We did expressions like that. That's an expression, has several operations in it. And this is an equation. Expression, equation. So that's all. So we're going to do expressions today with letters in them. So here's how it works. It's actually a pretty simple concept. In math, in algebra rather, mathematicians use letters to stand for or take the place of unknown values, numbers that they don't know in math problems. So for instance, we're going to take the most basic kind of version here. If I were to say 6 less than an unknown value, I think in the past we probably would have written it like this, like 6 unknown value, 6 less than it as I take 6 from it. So something like that, or that, or maybe that. We have these various ways to represent values we don't know, question marks, box, fill in the blank, something like that. So as you get into algebra, we don't do that anymore. We get more fancy and sophisticated than that. And we start using letters to represent values we don't know. And it doesn't make any difference which one. You know, I could make this be 6, I'll make W be my unknown value. Make it W minus 9. This means 9 less, not minus 9, minus 6. This means 6 less than some number that I don't know. We just represent it with a letter. Doesn't have to be W, it could be G. G minus 6. 6 less than some value that I don't know. There are a few that we don't use very often just because they tend to kind of look like numbers. Like we don't use a lot of L's because L's, look a lot like ones. So often you don't use L's. Usually also you'll notice traditionally we use lowercase letters. Not because you have to or not because there's any particular reason for that. Just kind of do. So we don't use a lot of L's because they look like ones. Also don't use a lot of O's because O's look like zeros. And so those are just a couple I would say to kind of avoid. Because they just kind of look like other math things. But that's it. So 6 less than an unknown value could be W minus 6, G minus 6, A minus 6. Doesn't make any difference at all what letter you pick. And so when you see a letter, that's what it means. It means it's a value that we don't know. Going the other way, you might see an expression like this with a letter in it. And if you see that, what that tells you is, I'm going to type it because I can type faster than I can write and more neatly. So this would be, the way I would say this is I would say an unknown value or an unknown number raised to the third power. And there's different ways you can say plus 9, right? Added to 9, increased by 9, 9 greater than, anything like that. So I'll just say increased by 9. There's lots of different wordings that mean plus. But I would say something like this. An unknown value raised to the third power, increased by 9. When you see that, that's all it means. The letter shouldn't scare you. It should just tell you, oh, it's a number we don't know. And so I can't tell you what this expression equals, because I don't know what the e is. Could be a 1, could be 2, could be 1.5, I don't know. And so you can't solve these, but right now we're just going to learn to read them. Okay? Before we get to the we do's, I want to talk about a couple traditions in math. So I told you we don't usually use L's because L's look a lot like 1s. And we don't use a lot of O's because O's look a lot like 0s. One of the most common letters chosen in expressions as a letter is X. And X seems like a really bad choice because it looks just like a multiplication sign. So instead of just not using X, now that you're in middle school, this is very strange, I know, because it's been so long. We pretty rarely use this symbol for multiplication anymore. Instead of not using X, there are other ways we represent multiplication now. So instead of 3 times 5, because that looks a lot like an X, and X is a common variable, some other ways you show multiplication are, most typically it gets replaced with a dot. 3 times 5 now looks like that. You got to be careful not to make it look like a decimal down low. It goes kind of like up in the middle of the numbers. But this means 3 times 5. Also, I know we're just barely getting used to parentheses, but sometimes you'll also see multiplication shown like this, 3 times 5. They're both in parentheses, tells you to multiply them. Or sometimes even just one of them in parentheses. All these things mean 3 times 5, and they're mostly to avoid using this symbol. When you get with a letter, there's even another way. So we would not write 3 times j. Let's make j my unknown number. Because this looks too much like an X, and it could be another unknown number, and it's confusing. So typically you'll either see this one way less, but it's possible. This one sometimes, or just nothing in between them. You might even see it just written like this. This means 3 times j, or 3 j's. J, you know. 3 times 5 is 3 5s. 5, 5, and 5 make 15. 3j is just j, j, and j. It's 3 sets of j. And so you could see it written any of these ways. These all mean multiplication now instead of using the times symbol. That's sort of too elementary school now. I'm going to cross that out. And so it takes a little getting used to. This multiplication sign you've used for a very, very, very long time is no longer a multiplication sign you'll see anymore. Division also typically doesn't get shown the same way either. Instead of like 3 divided by x. You know, we often deal with division, so we think of 1 divided by 2. One thing divided into 2 parts is a half. 1 divided by 2. 1 divided in 2. And you can do that other way. You know, 3 divided by 5 is 3 divided into 5 parts. And so most of the time, instead of writing division this way, you'll typically see it written this way. So this is 3 divided by an unknown number. You'll much less often see this. It's not totally off limits like the x is, but you won't see this as often. You'll more often see this. Or so this would be like an unknown number divided by 6. So those are going to be real common. We'll do that in the we do, but let me do a couple more examples first. So let's do, now knowing those ways to multiplication, let's do one with a multiplication sign. So if I'm going to see this, 3 times an unknown value decreased by 10. So I'm going to write 3 times an unknown value like, probably like this. There's no sign. That means 3 times the m. 3 m's. 3 times an unknown number. And then I'm out of that, I'm going to decrease that by 10. I don't need parentheses necessarily because this tells me to do the multiplication in the parentheses before I subtract. But I already would do that. I would already, with order of operations, do 3 times the m before I subtracted. So it's fine this way. All right. And then this bottom one, I would say that is 4 increased by 6 times an unknown number, or an unknown value, either way. 4 increased by 6 times an unknown value, whatever that is. And same thing with the parentheses. I don't need the parentheses because I would already multiply first. So putting them over there doesn't help. So that's how it works. It just stands for an unknown value. So I want to do, before we do examples in your notes, I want you to write these things down. So important, ways to show multiplications in these kinds of expressions. Again, you would not typically see 5 times a, because this looks too much like an x. Looks like letter x. So you'll usually see most common to least common. 5a is the most common way to see 5 times an unknown value. Next most common is probably this. Third most common is probably this. Least common is probably this. So all these mean 5 times unknown number. Doesn't matter which way, but most often you'll see this, 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 or this. Okay. And division, same deal. You won't usually see s divided by 4. You'll usually see s divided by 4. Like that. Okay? All right, moving on. Let's do a couple examples for your notes, and we'll be ready. So 25 more than 5 times an unknown value. So I've got 2 things here, 25 times more and 5 times an unknown value. So I'm going to start with my 5 times the unknown value, and then 25 more than it is going to be 25 added to it. This is the way I read that. I have this, and it's 25 more than it. Added to it. So you can pick any letter you would like. Does not make any difference which one you pick. So I'll do, I don't know, maybe a 5t plus 25. 5 times an unknown number, and then 25 more than that. There you go. That's how you write it. And last but not least, 12 less than the quotient of 10 and an unknown value. That would look, let's see, 12 less than. 12 less than, when I make 12 less than something, I subtract 12 from it. Right? If I had $100, 12 less than $100, I would take 12 away from 100. It's not 12 minus 100. It's 100 minus 12. 12 less than 100. So I need to know that first term first. So the quotient of 10 and an unknown value. Quotient means divide. So I would have the quotient of 10 and some unknown value, and 12 less than it. So that means I would take 10, divide it by whatever that is, then subtract 12. And there you go. You got your very first expressions with letters in them in math. Well done. Congrats. This is just the surface of it. We'll definitely go more into this in future days. But once you feel like you have a good handle on this, got your notes complete, I will see you tomorrow.